Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Sanctum Secorum Live. I'm Keeper Jen, and with me today are Keeper Mark.
Hello, everyone.
And Keeper Bob.
Hey, folks.
And we are deeply honored to once again be rejoined by author Michael Moorcock, creator of Elric, Hawkmoon, Jerry Cornelius, all the great heroes, right? This month sees the release of Caribbean Crisis and Voodoo Island, which is a revised and expanded version of his first published novel, along with a prequel story. Mike, welcome back to the Sanctum Secorum. It's awesome to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, it's been too long. So much has happened in the past year.
Not to me. Oh, I suppose it has to me too. Yeah. I just forget.
So Mike, I'm kind of curious, like, what was it like to revisit your very first novel so many years later?
It was horrible to revisit it because it had many hands involved, or several hands involved in writing it. My friend Jim Cawthorne came up with these, as it were, the central plot element, the mystery element. I then wrote it set in Cuba, and particularly at this time, it was 1959, 60, something like that. Cuba had not been demonized, and so there was quite a lot of hope involved in the revolution in America as well as in England. But the editor of the Sexton Blake Library, it was a series which is probably one of the longest running series, if not the longest running series of detective stories from the 1890s to the present.
Wow.
Anyway, he was the editor, and he was an actual fascist. He was an actual member of the fascist party.
Oh boy!
And he was a nice guy. I mean, we got on very well, but not on politics, obviously. And he was basically a drunk. I mean, he was a very nice drunk and just nuts as far as politics went. But he didn't like my politics in the Cuba in the story. I don't think it was actually Cuba. I think it was a South American republic, as it were, or rather an island republic, and Caribbean republic, yeah. So he changed all the politics. So by the time it came out, which was about 2 years, I think, after I'd written it, he had rewritten the politics and underpaid me for the book, I have to say, and generally messed around with it so much that I couldn't really face looking at it much. It wasn't. I've never really claimed it as my first book, and it's not really a novel. I mean, the original wasn't really a novel. They were long novelettes, I suppose. They were published in like tiny. If you think of a like a Doc Savage or something like that, the British version of that were like tiny sort of paperback size. And about the same wordage as say a Doc Savage or any of those pulps that
That's still
had novel length stories. What? Sorry.
That's still respectable length.
Oh yeah. It's still but it's not really a novel. I mean, they used to call it a novel all over the cover, as of course they always will, but strictly speaking, it was a long novella, and so I was sort of disappointed in it, and I always planned to rewrite it, and but every time I came to rewrite it, I couldn't face it. It was just awful. And I have a friend Mark Hodder, who really should be here, except he's in Spain, so he can't be here, at least not with me. But Mark has written some very good detective, sort of supernatural detective stories,
like Spring Hill Jack.
Yeah, Spring Hill Jack, exactly. And he's very well versed in the, as it were, British penny dreadful come pulp tradition. So he knows a lot of that stuff as much as I do. And he runs a site for the Sexton Blake fans. So he's got probably, I think he has to be the biggest, largest collection of Blake stories ever put together. More indeed than there were in the files of Fleetway Publications, who published it.
Oh wow!
There's because he was incredibly popular, so they published him in again. There's nothing like it in America quite. There were boys' papers which were made. They were weekly papers, and they were made up of maybe 6 stories, some of which were serials, some of which were single stories, and they came out of the penny dreadfuls, which tended to be, I suppose, sort of about this size, whereas the big boys papers like Boys Friend and Boys, I can't remember. I've got a bunch of them myself, but there's so many names. Were tabloid size, and no, they were bigger than tabloid size. They were bedsheet size, and so they're very hard to keep. I mean, and they're all falling apart, of course. Bits of them. My room is just a pit fill, a pit of poison as far as allergies are concerned, because these things keep breaking up all the time. You can't do anything about it. I suppose you could. I'm leaving them to Texas A&M, who've got a big collection of popular fiction. So presumably they'll be able to do something and keep them reasonably well preserved. But those started in the 1880s and ran until around 1910 or something like that, and then they began to become smaller. I think because the racks, most things were getting smaller, and they fit on the racks better. Sorry about this. This is all boring. Anyway, finally,
no,
Sexton Blake Library. The Sexton Blake Library. I should have brought some examples, but anyway, that came down to this little sort of pocket size. They were just slightly squarer than an ordinary regular paperback, but they fit in the pocket. And Fleetway were at that time the largest publisher of popular publications in the world. I mean, they had a vast number of these titles, many of which were that size, some of which were sort of more or less quarto size. And Sexton Blake appeared weekly in a paper called The Union Jack, which had nothing to do with the title, had nothing to do with Sexton Blake. It just had slowly morphed into his regular weekly paper. And there are a lot of people wrote, a lot of pretty well-known people wrote for Blake, often as their start in writing thrillers. Leslie Charteris, for instance, of The Saint, wrote quite a few Blakes.
Oh wow!
And quite a lot of other people did. Anyway, they often, what we called it was de-Blaking. They often took out the name Blake, which was copyright Fleetway, but nothing else was, and they added in a different name. I mean, sometimes just cross through Blake and put in, Smith or whatever name you wanted, and then you could sell them to hardback publishers, usually library publishers, who published a vast number of lending library books. So a lot of these went from being Sexton Blake libraries into again, I'm not sure. I don't know if the tradition existed in the States. It was we had public libraries, which tended to, to give you the slightly posher fiction, and then there were little lending libraries, very much like people used to have a video library in the back of their store. So they'd have like a wall of books. You could take out for, it was tuppence a week. I used to get them regularly. My mother used to get the romances, and I used to get, well, mostly the Edgar Rice Burroughs and the various other science fiction or fantasy, or occasionally the thrillers that were there. A lot of the thrillers had, as I say, been taken from Blake's. And I slowly realized this as a kid. I mean, I hadn't done any research. There wasn't an awful lot of research about at that time. But I slowly realized that these stories were very similar. And, what I'd read in the Sexton Blake library was turning up in an ordinary novel. Anyway, that's the sort of background, roughly the background of Sexton Blake Library. It ran monthly. First of all, it had, I think it was 4 copies a month. Then it was 5 copies a month in its heyday. Then it went down to, in the end, when I was editing it, or one of the editors of it, it was down to two copies a month, and that was into the 60s. Then after that, it went into paperback, straight paperback format, and slowly disappeared until Rebellion bought the rights of the Fleetway backlog, their copyrights, not the actual books, but the rights to their characters, because really they wanted 2000 AD, which was the magazine that sort of launched people like Alan Moore and so on. And those were they're only to discover, I think, that a lot of those were actually owned by the authors, so they didn't buy them anyway, but which I was quite pleased to hear about, I must say. But anyway, that's who published these. They published about, I think they had they were ambitious in what they wanted to publish of Sexton Blake, but I'm not sure they sold as well as they hoped. I think it's probably niche publishing rather than major publishing, like the way people again reprint Doc Savage and the Spider and all the various detective and science fiction pulps that people do. I think they did 4 anthologies, which Mark put together for them, of Sexton Blake stories, some of the best, and they were often extremely good and very well written. I mean, as I've often said, there are no pulp authors. There are people who write pulp fiction. And it's a matter of choice. It's some very, very good writers who wrote for the pulps, as we know. In science fiction, I mean, there wouldn't be any American science fiction, at least if there weren't any pulps. So that was essentially what happened, and so Mark suggested that since I was dawdling and was probably going to die before I ever did anything about it, that he rewrite Caribbean Crisis. And while we were working on that, we decided to make it, which I'd always really wanted to do, to use characters. For many people, the heyday of the Sexton Blake series was the 1930s, the sort of 20s and 30s, between the wars. And a lot of the great characters, sort of super villains, as it were, that he was up against, came up in those times, including Zenith the Albino, or Zenith the Albino, as he's pronounced in America, and you worry about Caribbean. So I'd already, as it were, incorporated Zenith into a series I'd done called The Metatemporal Detective, and use Zenith as the major villain there, because there was no copyright on Zenith. There was only copyright on Sexton Blake. And after there was one really good novel by the guy's name was George Phillips, but he wrote as Anthony Skene, and as Anthony Skene he published this one hardback novel, which was not a reprint of any kind, an original novel called Monsieur Zenith, which had one of the worst covers on it I've ever seen, and he was so disappointed with its bad sales that he never wrote another one, which is a great shame, because he was a pretty outstanding thriller writer. Wrote too much, as most pulp writers did, but the very best of them are as good as anything else you find. And so anyway, Mark and I decided that we would start using the supervillains rather than just do them as straight thrillers, because those are the ones we like best. And Caribbean Crisis had God, I've forgotten his name now, but one of the supervillains in that called, that's right, Huxton Rhymer, who was a surgeon and a doctor who'd gone wrong. I mean, he's a very rather complex character, which many of the best ones were, in that he was sort of mixed between good and evil, and he wanted to become good, but he couldn't help being evil, as it were. And he had a girlfriend called Mary Trent, and she was and we liked her too. So anyway, we decided that we'd rewrite Caribbean Crisis as one of that kind of Blake's, although we set it fairly late. And then while we were talking about that, we thought of another a sort of prequel to that story, using some of the other characters, including Marie. What was that? Oh God, Marie. It wasn't Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, but there was one of the other supervillains was this Voodoo Queen. So we decided, since we were writing about the Caribbean and so on, we'd have her in it too. So the second book that we wrote together, as it were, was Voodoo, I think, is it called Voodoo Island? I haven't got a copy. Rebellion are incredibly mean about sending out copies. I mean, authors don't get copies. You actually had to buy them. They give you a 50% discount, which is very generous. But anyway, that's Mark and I have since begun to write a very strange series using the metatemporal detective, but also using Zenith the albino. So we get and Zenith was my inspiration for Elric, needless to say. I mean, and a very similar sort of character, somewhat tortured and not sure whether he's doing good or bad and that sort of thing. And so we out of those two short novels, which are in the one book, we decided to start doing Zenith, a kind of modern Elric, in which the Elric mythos was incorporated into modern, as it were, modern iconography. So instead of being from Melnibone, he's from a small Romanian principality, which was often hinted at in the stories. And he and the Black Sword and all the various stuff that's in the Elric books has been put into or appears as part of the iconography of the first one, which Sohn Schuster bought recently, and it's called The Albino's Secret, I think, and it features this again. It's sort of like a modern Elric, with the metatemporal detective as the as obviously his counterpart. I mean, we really enjoyed doing it. It's again set in the 30s. It's really a sort of race across a Europe which is becoming increasingly Nazified, and so that Romania, Hungary, all those countries which were, as it were, toppling to some form of Nazi dictator, where that was happening, and it allowed us to well, it gave us a lot of good villains, of course, but it also we had Zenith and the metatemporal detective essentially teaming up to deal with a bunch of Nazis, not mostly not German Nazis. I think they were Romanian Nazis, mostly Romanian, and some of it set in Istanbul, and some of it set in other parts of Europe at the time. And since then, we've also started to write a series of one of the things I want to do is rewrite one or two of the metatemporal detective stories that I did, which Paya published about 20 years ago, I think. So we're working on one or two of the ones I didn't like very much, which weren't that good. They were done to commission at a time when I really shouldn't have accepted the commission. They're too hurried. So we're going to rewrite those first, and then we've got about I don't know.
That means you have to reread them again.
Well, yes, but I mean, it's not quite.
I remember
so bad
that you hate that.
The one that I don't like most has George Bush in it, but it's a rather simplistic. It was actually even, I think it was written before George even started the. I mean, I believe that Bush's invasion of Iraq gave, as it were, Putin permission to invade Ukraine and so on. I think it set off an entire chain of as it were, unfair and illegal wars, really, because it was false flag wars where you pretend there's something there that isn't there, and then go in. I mean, I was one of those who never believed for a moment there was any yellow cake or anything like it. The whole psychology of the situation showed that Bush was basically trying to do better than his dad, who actually was a much more sensible and intelligent diplomat than George Bush Jr. could ever have been. So I think the whole thing well, I mean, you could say it started from of course, I mean, you have to say it started from the Two Towers as well. I mean, without the Two Towers, he probably wouldn't have had the excuse to go into Iraq. But why Iraq? I've still no idea, since it had absolutely nothing to do with the Two Towers. But I think those two figures, anyway, were the on both sides, as it were, our side and their side, were responsible for what's for the state the world's in at the moment, as far as wars are concerned. And to me, I mean, I don't want to go on with this too long, but since I can set stories in the 30s, which was another age of dictators and right-wing rhetoric coming to the fore, I feel I can express some of the concerns I have about the current situation of the world, which looks pretty bad to me. I mean, I'm always optimistic, and I'm always hopeful, but it's pretty hard to be optimistic and hopeful with wars of the kind that are breaking out. What's going on in Israel? What's going on, in Ukraine in particular, but I don't think that's all that's going to, I think we've got to be very, very careful, or we'll find ourselves in a very serious war. And since so many of the nuclear bases in America are set in Texas, I'm particularly worried.
Fair.
It's of particular interest.
Yes,
I can understand.
Apparently, Kim Il Jong has Austin is his prime target if a nuclear war ever breaks out, because apparently we've got the most military bases and the most nukes around. So they've got to get rid of us first, which I suppose in some ways will be a I'd rather not see the rest of the sequel.
Well, thinking about wars in a less despondent tone for a moment, I recently learned while I was doing some research that you worked on the screenplay for one of my favorite movies when I was younger, The Land That Time Forgot. You were talking about having Rhett Burroughs. So
I did that whole screenplay actually. Jim, what happened was that Jim Cawthorne, who's primarily known as an artist, but we worked together as writers quite often too. Jim had already broken it down into a comic, and so he had the breakdown. So I used his breakdown to write my script, and that's how we worked on that. And we luckily had Egg Rice Burroughs Incorporated were on our side. They refused the producer's script, which was absolutely abominable. I mean, really, really bad. If you've seen the later films that they made, you've got a fair idea of how bad they were. And they for some reason named me. I have no idea why. I mean, I had, of course, edited Tarzan Adventures many years before that, and I was an Egg Rice Burroughs fan, and I think I had a phase when I wasn't a fan for a few years, the way one does, and then I came back to it, and I'm a fan again. But anyway, so they insisted on me doing the script, which is very, very rare for you to get that kind of backing. And without me doing the script, they wouldn't let them have the rights to do The Land That Time Forgot. So Jim's also great. I mean, we started together on Burroughsiana, the fanzine the Egg Rice Burroughs fanzine that I used to do in the 50s, and so we were both keen fans, and we wanted to try to make a Burroughs movie that was as close to the Burroughs books as possible. Also, it was a very interesting idea. It was probably one of the few Burroughs novels that had a true science fiction idea running through it. The idea of as it were ancestry, people going from, as it were, newts to humans. So it was a little of that did get subdued and cut out in the final movie. And one of my conditions was that we didn't have a volcano going off at the end of the movie, because all these movies have volcanoes going off at the end. And they say, "Oh no, of course not. No. I mean, this was my first. I think it was my first experience of working in movies, and I
remember a volcano at the end."
I still thought that Hollywood producers were as good as their word. I mean, that soon left me. There was a bit like that Nathaniel West movie, book about Hollywood, Day of the Locust, and I think anyway. So I learned a lot of lessons writing that script, including not to trust the word of the producer, who was actually a classic cartoon Hollywood producer. I mean, he smoked these huge cigars. He was about 3 feet high, and he called everybody baby. I mean, it was very hard to take him seriously. Anyway, we wrote the script according to Burroughs. I think what we did was we truncated. There are two early scenes with a lot of messing around on a U-boat, and we cut out one of those messing around on the U-boat scenes because they were more or less replicated, but the rest of it was pretty much straight Burroughs, except we made the German character, rather than making him a kind of swaggering Hun. And of course, these stories were written during the First World War, so that's, they had that characteristic to them. We turned the guy into a biologist who knew quite a bit about dinosaurs and the like, so he could be the voice of the theory, as it were. While Doug McClure could be the guy, running around saving girls from dinosaurs. And anyway, that was I think it was the first movie to have fixed wing pterodactyls. That's, I mean, most it was actually fairly effective. Given this was what, early 70s,
I think 74.
Like,
I think, yeah.
And I said to them, I was quite impressed by the rushes. I said, how do you get those effects? And they said, oh, we just use glove puppets. We just shove our hands up the back of them and do the stuff with glove puppets. So, but they couldn't do that with the pterodactyls, of course. So they had to have them, flying around fixed wings, because they couldn't get flapping into the stuff. So anyway, yeah, I enjoyed writing the film, and was a bit disappointed, of course, in the volcanoes, which sure enough did turn up. I remember I went on the set one day. It was at Shepperton, and I saw these big tubs, oil drums of what looked like oatmeal, which actually turned out to be oatmeal. And I said, what are the those drums for? And they said, oh, that's the oatmeal. And I said, well, yeah. I said, well, what's the oatmeal for? They said, oh, well, that's when people fall into the lava and and get absorbed by the lava. I said, there isn't any lava in the script. They said, no, it's where the volcano. That's the first time I heard it. It was far too late. It's where the volcano goes off at the end. So it's at that point I began to withdraw from the project. I actually did have a contract to do the two other films that the company made, but I just couldn't face it. Jim stayed with it for a little longer than I did, partly because he was slightly more fascinated by the whole business of filmmaking and so on. But eventually,
I'm fascinated by oatmeal. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, I like oatmeal. I'm nothing against. I don't want to, but I don't think I could eat a whole oil drum full. I must admit. Anyway, Jim bailed out as well. I mean, we both, and the old guy. By this time, the Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated had changed managers. They were in some kind of flux at the time. And I like the guy we were working with, and he really was, serious. He wanted to do some decent movies, but I think he left, and then Milton Zabusky, who I actually liked, because Milton was again very much like a classic old-fashioned cartoon Hollywood producer, and I knew him. I already knew him from I think John Brunner, a science fiction writer, had used to have him at parties, and he'd once sat down and told me how they were going to do this authentic Robin Hood film. And when I saw it, it used so many library clips that it covered about, I would say, at least 1,000 years of history, given the costumes that the people were wearing in different scenes. It was not an expensively made film. I think it was called Last Siege of the Saxons in the end. And I don't think it's regarded as a classic, and I don't think it has the enthusiasm, the enthusiasts for it that Land That Time Forgot had. I actually quite liked, apart from the last bit, which was supposed to end on a slightly melancholy note, as the first one, as the Burroughs one did, where he doesn't know whether he's going to be rescued or not, and there's this sort of slight lyricism to it at the end, not knowing what's going to happen. And then, of course, I was going to write the sequel where he gets other people come to Caprona and just carried on from the Burroughs original. But it was just too. I don't know. I just had too much respect for the original material to want to see what happened happen again. So, what happened after that was, oh no, just hang on a minute. I think I must have. I think what. Oh, that's what happened. They did a movie of my book, The Final Program, which was again a complete travesty of the novel, which happens. I mean, everybody complains about this, but in my case, I have certain things I'm fairly serious about, and they reversed a lot of the meaning, the content of of what I was trying to say. So I got very disappointed. The reason I took on the job, one of the reasons I took on the job for Land That Time Forgot, is because I wanted to learn how to write screenplays myself, because I hadn't, I turned down the job of writing my own screenplay at the time because I didn't think I knew enough about it. Of course, I didn't realize at the time that the whole thing is a shambles, and you can be 12 years old and an intelligent dog to, and probably write half the movies that come out of the movie industry. So I was I was slightly more serious than I probably should have been. I don't have that element of cynicism which the best screenwriters tend to have, where they just write it and forget it. And I don't blame them for being like that or doing. But there are too many people, too many captains on board the ship, as it were, to make it a very satisfactory job.
I'm just steamed that I was robbed of a sequel of one of my favorite movies when I was younger because they had to throw in a volcano.
Yeah,
that's just not fair. That is totally not fair.
I was very disappointed. I mean, I would love to have done, done the others. It would have. I mean, I would love to have done a whole lot of them if the chances had come up. But essentially, the Land That Time Forgot was. I mean, it wasn't on a big budget, but it was successful. It made money. But then they because Milton thought he could write and Milton could not write, they gradually went downhill. Well, not gradually, they swiftly went downhill, and they stopped making money. They just didn't have the quality, which, I know that, I mean, they're only, dinosaur adventures. It's not like I was writing Casablanca, but it's still, it still has to have some authority to it, some sense of well, the maker's sort of concern, like the old Universal movies, which were nearly all made, as it were, by James Whale, and were very, very good movies. He knew what he was doing. So it did make me feel rather cynical. The Final Program, which again has become a cult movie, lots of people like it, but which is fair enough. I mean, I'm not one to argue with people's taste, but I didn't like it, and it was disappointing to me. So when I did Land That Time Forgot, I thought I was going to do it. Then I wrote a book called Letters from Hollywood, which is probably the best thing in that book are the illustrations of Hollywood in the 70s, and by Mike Foreman. It's just full of beautiful colored drawings. And in that, I wrote how I was asked to go out to Hollywood to write with for Irving Kershner, who did the second Star Wars movie. and at the time was riding very high on that, because, as I said, my dog Spot could have written the second Star Wars movie, and and it would still have had huge success, and it was when Kirshner started he badmouthed every writer he'd ever worked with, and they were some of the best writers in Hollywood. I mean, really good people who are well known, and known to be very good writers. And one of them was Lee Brackett, who was a very good friend of mine. Lee Brackett had written the first script for Star Wars, and I suspect it was a much better script than Kirshner finally produced for the second movie. So anyway, so he was doing well because of that, and this I actually went crazy during this, or I nearly had a breakdown. I mean, I'm a pretty healthy. I'm not the sort of person who usually has nervous breakdowns, and but working with Kirshner was just a nightmare. And if you want to read a book about the worst that can happen to you in Hollywood, I think probably Letters from Hollywood is. I did them as a series of letters written to my friend J.G. Ballard, who was then editing a magazine, and had asked me. I'd written him just personal letters, and he'd said, I'd like to publish these. So I started writing them for him for the magazine, and then they were published in this very beautiful book, which, because it didn't have anything to do with fantasy whatsoever, well, unless Hollywood, depends what you mean. But anyway, because it had nothing to do with Hollywood, nothing to do with fantasy, didn't do very well. They printed a vast number of copies. You could pick them up on eBay. I'm not advertising this really, but you can pick them up on eBay for a very small price, and it's worth the price just for the illustrations.
We will definitely have to look for those.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to find. I mean, you can get them for a few dollars on eBay, or you could until relatively recently. Mm-hmm. It may be that people have discovered, what happens, people discover that you can, and then all the dealers start buying them up, and then they sell them for some vast price. But it's a book I like to recommend to people, because they really are beautiful illustrations. Mike Foreman's probably one of the best illustrators alive, book illustrators alive, and I really was. It was a privilege to have him, and they're all coloured. I don't think there's a single black and white picture in the whole book, and there's lots of pictures. I was going to do another book with him called Letters from Morocco, but this book, Letters from Hollywood, did so badly I never got to do my Letters from Morocco. But
that's a shame.
Poor Mike took his whole family out to Morocco, which they hated, in order to prepare for the book, which never came out.
Well, we've covered some books, we've covered some films. What about music? You've been involved with quite a number of projects. Which one was your favorite?
Well, my favorite, I suppose, was the last one I did wholly by myself. Oh, that's stupid. I meant that I controlled wholly. I mean, anyway, it's called Live from the Terminal Cafe, which is a lie, because although there really is a Terminal Cafe in Mississippi, which I've been to, this was not the Terminal Cafe in Bold, and it wasn't live. We made it in a studio in Paris, but I made it with my friend Martin Stone, who's now dead, and Martin wanted to do, I don't know, he wanted to do an album with me, and I wanted to do an album with him. He'd been in a lot of really good bands. He's a superb guitarist. I mean, he's one of the sort of legendary guitarists that people in the industry, as it were, know, rather than people in the music papers know. So we did that, and it links in with the books, a series of books I did around the turn of this century called The War Amongst the Angels was the last book, and Blood was the first book. And the middle book because I always write in trilogies, was called Fabulous Harbours, and it uses that background, which is very strange. It's a mixture of absurdism and the development of my multiverse idea, which now, of course, has become just a name for comic book people to say why there are glitches in their storylines, but it was originally an idea based on the many worlds theory, which of course Wells was the first to do in fiction. I tried to come up with a theory that explained the idea of a multiverse using Mandelbrot's mathematics, and I did most of this. Most of the explanation for all of this is in the comic book I did with mostly with Walter Simonson, called Michael Moorcock's Multiverse. This is before multiverse was a generally used name. It was the 90s, so I took a number of storylines and gradually brought them together. One's an Elric storyline, one's a Jerry Cornelius storyline, and Metatemporal Detective, and what's the other one? Well, one's another storyline. What the hell was it? Anyway, there are 3 storylines, and eventually in the final, there are 12 issues, and in the final issue, all the storylines merge to become one. And in that book, which has just been reissued again by Titan, I explain my, as it were, theory of the multiverse in I suppose you call it pseudo-scientific terms. I mean, I don't pretend to be a mathematician or a scientist, but it's the best shot I could give it to making a rational explanation for a many worlds idea. And it's disappointing, basically, because with Mandelbrot, it's the idea of self-similarity. You've got every world is pretty much exactly the same. So there are no vast changes between one and another until you've been through millions and millions of change of versions of the universe. So it's a bit of a downer if you like the idea of another world being next door, because the world next door is not any different to our world, as in Mandelbrot's ideas of self-similarity. Anyway, so what I like to do is I like to take a form that's regarded by the literati as a low form, such as comic books, well, they're not so much now, but they were then, and put serious big ideas into the comic, or into whatever form it is. So I like to take a popular form that's usually not particularly serious, and give it and add to it, use the structures of it and the pleasures of it, but then put something else in to make it, if you like, slightly more serious, much like Land That Time Forgot, which is we come back to. So anyway, I don't want to bore on. I'm sorry, it sounds boring. But anyway, that's where that's where my multiverse, which is probably closer to some of the scientists' ideas of many worlds and string theory and so on, but they're not. They don't have a very a very snazzy, you know, well, it's not like Batman and Superman, as it were. But I do my best, and that's sorry. That's what the songs of Live from the Terminal Cafe come out of that the books where I first started to explore this multiverse, this idea of the multiverse. But the songs are Cajun influence mostly, so it's mostly a sort of country Cajun feel to it. There's narrative that probably puts anybody off to start with. Then it goes into very pretty much straight country Cajun style songs. And I'm about to do a record with Alan Davey. Cleopatra is the record company, and the Bouchard brothers, who were as it were one of the mainstays of Blue Oyster Cult, have particularly Albert have been doing a long musical project, which is just about coming to the end, on a series of books I did called called The Dances at the End of Time, and which was a romance and a comedy set at the end of time. And they liked him a lot, so they've done this musical project, which is over, I think, 4 records. First 2 books are done as a record each, and the last book is done as 2 records. So I just got the first of the last
Wow.
third in just the other day. And then I'm going to do, and I'm on that too. I mean, I'm playing on it and singing on it, and then I'm doing a guy called Alan Davey, who used to be in Hawkwind. He's a drummer, and he does a huge amount of stuff. Lives in California now. He wanted me to re-sing, as it were, a number of my own old songs, plus a number of my sort of opposite number, Robert Calvert, who we both fronted Hawkwind at different times. My Robert was well, he was crazy, to put it shortly, and had to go away for a few weeks every so often to rest in a nursing home. And when that happened, I would fill in for him, fronting the band. And because he was worried that I was going to take over his job, I made it clear to him that as soon as he came out of the bin, which is the technical term I didn't use before, but as soon as he came out of the institution, he could, I would back off and he could come back to his job, which is pretty much how we ran it for a number of years. And I've always liked his songs. He's a very, very good songwriter. He was a beautiful songwriter. And so I'm going to sing some of his songs as well as some of my own on this new album, which we're going to start probably in the new year, I think, now.
Did we get like a full-blown musical out of it at this point? I mean,
no,
the entire media genre?
The concept album I did was the first album I did, which was called New World's Fair, and that was a it was a concept album, which I suppose is the nearest you can get to a musical in that way. But again, I wasn't entirely satisfied. I'm never satisfied with what I've done anyway, so it's silly of me to keep saying I wasn't satisfied with this, I wasn't satisfied with that. But I do. I'm always trying to improve. It's like get on a school report, can do better, and my own school report always goes can do better. Of course, it's always after the book's been published. Like that. Yes, I think so. I think so. At least if we're sane. I think it's the people who don't think, who think they are doing better, that probably are the ones that aren't doing better. I've known 1 or 2 people like that who tell you, that they're the greatest writer in the universe or whatever, and they're usually not really very good. Anyway,
Mike,
yeah, that's the music.
It has been wonderful having you back with us, and our time together has been all too brief. But at the risk of having your wife yell at us, we should probably start wrapping.
Oh, well, you only get it for a couple of minutes.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I actually, she's not very well, so she hasn't got as much steam up as she normally would have. But yeah, I mean, I enjoy. Well, I mean, you're asking me to talk about myself. Who doesn't like people?
Well, we like listening to you talk about yourself.
Well,
so.
Thank you.
And
you
are full of amazing
doing
stories.
it again sometime. I mean, I enjoyed it.
We would love to have you again.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome.
Well, yeah.
In the meantime, for our listeners, if you want to tune in this coming Tuesday night to see, well, the other people on the screen currently, Mark and Bob and myself are going to be talking about The Blue Star by Fletcher Pratt. And that'll be our new.
That's interesting. I look forward to that. Yeah. Yeah, great.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I like Fletcher Pratt. Well, you know, he's not that well known anymore, and it's nice to know you're doing something about him.
Absolutely, we have to honor everybody who paved the way, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
You do.
Well, I think he and Spray de Camp between them did some great. I mean, they're certainly amongst my favorites, if not my. You know, I mean, I love them. Yeah, great, good. Okay, well, I look forward to that. Not so much to me, but The Blue Star, which I hope you, you know, I hope I get the Blue Star as well as me waffling on.
It's always great to see you, and yes, I would love to meet up with you again, see what you've done next year around this time.
Well, yeah, I'm just finishing the last book in another trilogy, so I think next year will be music mainly. I'm not sure yet, but
awesome.
And probably some detective stuff.
Oh, yep. Nice.
Good. Well, I'll keep busy then.
And our fans love you. Your fans love you. So.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
With that, just want to give a quick shout out to Linda Moorcock for her patience, Elena, of course, and thanks Mark and Bob and all of our fans for making this happen today.
And thank you for coming back, Mike.
Thanks.
Absolute treat.
Great. I'll see you again. Yeah.
All right.
Cheers. Bye.
Good night, everybody.